זה תהליך הדרגתי. לאט לאט, לאט לאט. זו קלישאה, אני יודעת, הוא היה אהבת חיי. התחתנו, בית חדש במושב. נכנסתי להיריון, החיים היו טובים. הוא חשב שאני צריכה לעזוב את העבודה שלי. הייתי קצת עצובה, אבל קיבלתי מתנת שחרור. 4.3 קילוגרם של תינוק בריא. קוראים לו שחר. והוא צדק. אני יכולה עכשיו להישאר בבית ולשמור על הבן שלנו. לגדל תינוק זה דבר יקר ומתיש. הייתי מותשת ובודדה ולבד. אז הוא הציע לעזור לנהל את כל החשבונות. מדהים איך שבהתחלה לא שמה לב בכלל. ואז הוא הציע שאני אכניס את כל החסכונות שלי לחשבון הבנק המשותף שלנו. ככה הוא יוכל לשלם יותר מהר על המשכנתה. כל הזמן אמר, זה לא כסף שלו, כסף שלי, כסף שלנו. לאט, לאט. ואז הוא החליט שאנחנו צריכים להיות זהירים יותר עם ההוצאות שלנו. הוא הכניס אותי לתוכנית כספית קפדנית. קיבלתי 60 שקל לשבוע בשביל כל ההוצאות. אפילו לא יכולתי להרשות לעצמי את הדלק שייקח את שחר לבית ספר. הוא אשכרה שכנע אותי שההליכה תעשה לנו טוב. ואז הוא התחיל לדרוש קבלות. על כל דבר. איפה הייתי? עם מי הסתובבתי? על מה בזבזתי? הוא לקח את כל כרטיסי האשראי שלי, וכשניסיתי להיכנס לתוך חשבון הבנק גיליתי שהוא שינה את כל הסיסמאות. ניסיתי לדבר איתו. אבל הוא פשוט נהיה כועס. הוא עמד וצרח עליי. הוא אמר לי שאני טיפשה, שאני לא מספיק טובה. הוא מאשים אותי. הוא אומר שזו אשמתי, שאני שכחנית. אני ממש צריכה לבקש ממנו כסף, לאוכל, לבגדים, להכל. לפעמים אני מרעיבה את עצמי, רק כדי שלא אצטרך לבקש. אני מפחדת. אין לי עם מי לדבר. הוא לא ממש שיקע אותי, אז אף אחד לא יאמין לי. אני לא יודעת מה לעשות. אני רק רוצה לקחת את שחר וללכת. אבל אני לא יכולה. אין לי כסף, ואין לי איך לצאת מכאן.
Welcome, everyone. Women's Spirit launched a massive campaign to raise awareness to the complex issue of economic abuse. The clip we just watched shows how the normative course of life turns into economic abuse, a relationship of terror and control. Thank you, SEA, Surviving Economic Abuse Organization in the UK, for allowing Women's Spirit to recreate your clip. Good morning, everyone. I'm Ronit Kfir, your moderator for today's conference. I'm very honored to take part in the Women's Spirit 3rd International Conference on Economic Abuse. First of all, we would greatly appreciate it if you would kindly open your cameras and be with us face to face. Bank Discount is Women's Spirit partner in the fight against abuse of women. Women's Spirits thanks them for their partnership. We are honored to have with us today guests from all around the world. Our speakers today include Dr. Catherine Royal to give us a global view of economic abuse. Rebecca Glenn will share with us the response of banks and governments in Australia. Professor Dalit Yasur Borochovich will speak about no laws, are there remedies? Ms. Rosie Miller-Minster will share her story of women's spirit. It is important for me to point out that if the content of this conference raises questions, feelings, and emotions that you would like to share, you can leave your details on the Facebook page and we will direct you to the right professional at Women's Spirit. In addition, any conference questions, kindly write in the chat here and we will address them at the end of the conference. Any unanswered questions will be answered via email, and a recording of this conference will be sent to everyone. At Women's Spirit Former Conference on January 2018, we discussed the characteristics, patterns, and tools of economic abuse. And today, Women's Spirit, together with leading organizations from around the world, Center of Women's Economic Safety from Australia, SEA, Surviving Economic Abuse from the UK, Good Shepherd from New Zealand, and Emek Israel College from Israel, we will discuss the phenomenon and what we can do to stop it. Economic abuse is invisible to the eye, but it affects millions of people around the world every year. Economic abuse is the use of money and resources as a sanction or threat or as means of control over someone. Understanding and treating economic abuse is critical in the battle against domestic abuse and the rehabilitation of its survivors as they break free from the cycle of abuse. I'm pleased to invite Tamar Schwartz, the Executive Director of Women's Spirit, to say a few words. Mrs. Schwartz holds a BA in social work and an MA in interdisciplinary art therapy. She served as a senior organizational consultant in the Israel Defense Forces, and for 8 years, she was the CEO of Mesila, an aid center for refugees and immigrants. Mrs. Schwartz is an alumnus of the Mandel Leadership Institute and has won several prestigious awards, including Joint Ashalim Award and the Presidential Award for Fighters of Human Trafficking. Tamar.
Thank you so much, Ronit. Great honor. Thank you so much. 5 years ago, the media in Israel was occupied with Orna Berry. Professor Orna Berry was and still is a woman who is seemingly perfect. In academics, she's a professor. In the public sector, she served as the director of the Ministry of Science. In business, she was the first Israeli woman to have an exit in high tech. She looks great. She lives in Ramat Aviv, which is a very good neighborhood in Tel Aviv in Israel. She's the mother of 3 wonderful children, and she was married to a violent and abusive man for 17 years. Her husband controlled her bank account. She had to account for every penny she spent, despite the fact that she earned much more than him. He gave her an allowance. And when she finally divorced him, she discovered, to her shocking disbelief, that he had left her with huge debts, which were now her responsibility to pay off. In Israel, there are 800,000 women like Professor Berry. Every 5th woman is a survivor of abuse, all kinds of abuse. On the average, a woman stays in the vicious cycle of abuse at least 10 years. This is a very long time. Those women feel that they cannot deal with life on their own without a partner, and most have low self-esteem. Something else that is shocking, 66% of those who already manage to get themselves out of this vicious circle of abuse and reach a shelter return to their abusive partner because they are dependent upon them economically. To this point, we step in. Women's Spirit, our work is with occupational economic rehabilitation of women survivors of abuse. All of the studies on this issue show that economic dependency is the number one reason for a woman to remain or return to the vicious cycle of abuse. Women's Spirit trains hundreds of women from all over Israel, from all walks of life and profession, to serve as positive role models, to be mentors. Each mentor is like a loving and reinforcing big sister to the survivor of abuse. The uniqueness of our process is that it lasts up to 2.5 years on a weekly basis. It is long, personal, and intensive. The fact that the process with a mentor is a long and personal one is very critical because we are dealing with post-traumatic survivors of abuse and therefore the regular process that exists in Israel regarding occupational rehabilitation do not apply to them. The mentor helps the survivor to identify her own occupational desires, what her strengths are, and she helps her open a bank account, teaches her how to manage economically, how to find employment, and to earn a living. Woman Spirit has been operating this model for 16 years. Most of the survivors who come to us succeed in achieving economic independence. They do not return to the vicious cycle of abuse, and they constitute a model for their children, thus preventing passing such behavior onto the next generation, something which unfortunately characterized the vicious cycle of abuse. In June 2019, Woman Spirit was recognized by the ECOSOC of the UN as a special advisor to the United Nations in the domain of abuse against women. Our goal is to raise awareness to the issue of economic abuse and the ways in which we can stop this vicious cycle between economic dependency and abuse. Thank you all for joining us at this important conference today. Many precious people and organizations worked hard for this conference, and it's time to thank them, because without them, it simply wouldn't have happened. So I'm privileged to mention, first, I want to thank the dear women who will speak here today and will share with us their great knowledge. Rebecca Glenn, Dr. Catherine Royal, Professor Dalit Yasur Borochovich, Dr. Merav Shmueli, and Rosie Miller-Minster. I want to thank the foundation that supported this conference, Jewish Women's Fund of Atlanta, the Hadassah Foundation, Greater Miami Jewish Federation, the Harry and Jeanette Weinberg Foundation, Horizon Foundation from South Palm Beach, Florida, the Cheryl Saban Self-Worth Foundation for Women and Girls. Thank you all for your financial contribution to our joint work over the years in general and to our international conference in particular. And finally, I'm so excited to thank the wonderful staff of Woman Spirit, all the amazing workers, volunteers, board of directors, and especially to my dear, beloved management. I love you so much. Amy Slater Ovadia, Rosie Miller-Minster, and to Dr. Merav Shmueli, all three of them who conceived the conference and are the living spirit of it. I wish all of us a fruitful and fascinating conference. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tamar. Thank you. Dr. Merav Shmueli, advocate, one of the leaders of this conference, a human rights lawyer specializing in gender equality, has worked both in the government and in civil society organizations. Dr. Shmueli has taught academic courses on gender and the law in different academic institutions, worked at the anti-trafficking unit at Israel's Ministry of Justice. In 2017, Merav joined Women's Spirit as the Director of Policy and Legislation. Merav.
Thank you, Ronit, and thank you all of you. About 70 years ago, Simone de Beauvoir wrote in her famous book, The Second Sex, that civil rights that had been given to women by law, such as the right to vote, would remain abstract unless women were also given economic independence. In the 70 years or so that have passed since she published those words, much has changed and improved with regard to the rights of women. But still, in many homes, women are not economically independent. Not because they choose to be dependent, not because they wish to be ignorant about money. They remain dependent because of deliberate, active efforts of abusive partners who deny these women of their freedom to make economic choices, and therefore deny them of freedom, period. These abusive partners use a variety of ways in order to keep women economically dependent, all of which can be termed economic abuse in an intimate relationship, which is the focus of this conference. As Ronit has mentioned, economic abuse has to do with control. One person is trying to control another person by restricting or exploiting their money or economic resources. And this may take many different forms. I'll only mention a few. For example, preventing a woman from working or from obtaining a profession, limiting her access to financial resources and her use of these resources, carefully monitoring her expenses, even the smallest ones, hiding financial information from her, stealing money from her, coercing debts upon her in ways of fraud, threat, or manipulation. And these are just a few examples. We will hear more examples today of patterns of economic abuse. Economic abuse in an intimate relationship is a gendered phenomenon. It affects more women than men. And like any kind of gender-based violence, it is informed by social perceptions about the roles and the place of women in society and in the family. We will say it again and again today. Economic abuse is about controlling women and about keeping them in their proper place. This explains why economic abuse has nothing to do with the economic situation of the family. It is not about the need to save. It may happen in wealthy families. It may happen in families where the woman works and even if she earns well, because the question is not who earns money and how much, but rather who decides what to do with the money. So clearly, economic abuse is very harmful. It violates a woman's autonomy. It affects her well-being, and it may deprive her of the most basic needs, including food. The effects of economic abuse are felt for years, sometimes many years after a divorce. But economic abuse is not only harmful in itself, it may also indicate and predict something more severe that may follow, including femicide. In some of the recent Israeli cases of murder of women by their partners, there was no physical abuse before the murder, but there was economic abuse. In these cases, had the economic abuse been identified in time, perhaps human lives could have been saved. Because of these reasons, economic abuse must be prevented and eliminated. It must be recognized as a distinct phenomenon with distinct characteristics, which requires distinct responses. Women's Spirit fights economic abuse on many fronts. We provide individual assistance to women who wish to recover after abusive relationships. We bring the issue to the public attention, to decision-making, and to legal forums. And we do a lot of education and awareness-raising work. Today's conference is our third big conference on economic abuse. And this time, we have decided to look at the phenomenon with an international lens, to focus on economic abuse around the world. Gender-based violence, including, of course, economic abuse, happens everywhere around the world. Although countries differ from each other, economically, socially, politically, geographically, demographically, despite all of these differences, I am certain that what is happening inside a home, behind closed doors, in cases of domestic abuse, is quite similar in countries that may be far from each other and which have different legal systems. The ways the offenders act, the consequences of their acts on the victims, the difficulty to identify the phenomenon, and other factors repeat themselves in different places. However, in different countries, different responses and solutions have been offered to economic abuse by the legislator, by the financial system, the welfare system, women's organizations, and by other stakeholders. We feel that it is highly important to learn about the different responses. Today's conference will provide an opportunity for a global discussion and of learning from each other's experiences. We chose to hold the conference at the end of November, the busiest time of year for all of us who work to end gender-based violence. As most of you know, the 25th of November is the day marked by women's organizations and by the UN as International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, a day in which we are called to raise public awareness of violence against women. The 25th of November also marks the beginning of the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence, an annual campaign that runs through International Human Rights Day on the 10th of December, a very busy and intense period. And within this intense period, more recently, another important day was announced on the 26th of November, the Economic Abuse Awareness Day. Economic Abuse Awareness Day began in Canada in 2019, when the Canadian Centre for Women's Empowerment called for greater recognition of economic abuse. Later, the campaign was joined by organizations from 5 other countries: Australia, the Centre for Women's Economic Safety, the UK, Surviving Economic Abuse, New Zealand, the Good Shepherd Organization, South Africa, the Institute for Social Development and Justice, and Israel, Women Spirit. These 6 organizations in 6 different countries have formed the Economic Abuse Global Coalition. And a recent report of the Global Coalition will be sent to all of you after the conference. We are privileged to be part of the Global Coalition and to have its representatives here with us today. I would like to thank our partner organizations also for the wonderful professional materials and tools that they have produced. We have been enriched and inspired by these tools, and I personally have often quoted them in policy papers and in legal documents. Bringing up-to-date examples, studies, and data from other countries has helped us in Israel to advance our arguments regarding economic abuse. Naming a specific date as Economic Abuse Awareness Day is important because still there is not enough awareness of this issue among the general public as well as among relevant institutions. In our work, we have found that it indeed takes effort to explain what economic abuse is and to convince that it requires specific measures. But we've also realized that once the awareness and understanding are established, women who suffer from economic abuse may receive better, more flexible, less judgmental responses from the authorities. I would like to conclude these opening remarks by stressing the importance of listening to the women themselves, to those women who have been subject to economic abuse. Women's Spirit is about to publish a book, a collection of testimonies of women from diverse groups in Israeli society: Jewish and Arab women, religious and secular women, immigrant and Israeli-born women, educated and less educated women. In the book, these women speak openly about their experiences, in their own words, in their own voices. Their stories explain better than any legal or theoretical explanation what it really means to experience economic abuse. We thank the women who have bravely agreed to expose their painful stories in order to assist other women. Our hope is that the book may help judges, lawyers, social workers, bankers to understand the real meaning and consequences of living under economic abuse. And most importantly, we hope that women who experience economic abuse and who do not realize that what they are experiencing is indeed abuse will understand that they are not alone, that there is a name to what they are experiencing, and that they can seek and receive help. I wish us all a very engaging discussion today. Thank you.
It took me 15 years of marriage to first realize I was a survivor of abuse. During that time, I tried to maintain my fantasy that everything was fine, really fine. It sounds crazy, absurd. I was the CEO of a huge company with over 1,000 employees, but I didn't know how much money I had in the bank. I had no access to my salary, even though I was the one who provided for the house, the children, everyday expenses. I was completely dependent upon him. He ran my life. I thought he was a superhero. I was sure I could do nothing without him. I met him at the university, my husband. We had 7 years of on-again, off-again relationship. I remember once he got furious about something and literally threw me out of the car by my parents' home. I didn't have a key. It was winter, it was cold. He said he couldn't care less. I was stuck outside for hours. He sent me flowers a few days later. We got back together. Once we were married, his mother started telling me unbelievable stories about the family. His father was violent, beat his mother. He forbade her to work. She was financially dependent upon him. And every time she said, I'm going to leave, I want to go, he said, there's the door. Get out, go. She stayed. There were many times my husband stopped speaking to me. There was always a different reason. I lost a credit card receipt. I lost a credit card. I refused to have sex with him. I even put my hair in a ponytail and my face was showing. I was ugly. Every day when I left the house, he would sit in the living room and say to me, that's how you're leaving the house? My mother's maid looks prettier than you. And when he walked into the house, he would say, ooh, what is that smell? Oh, it's you. You stink. He called me lazy. I got up at 7 and not at 5. You know what? I slowly realized he was right. I was lazy. He told me what a rotten mom I was. He'd tell the children, I'm raising you. All your mother does is work. He convinced me that I was clumsy, stupid, and ugly, and not smart. We had few friends. I wasn't allowed to be on the phone or on the computer. He would say, when you're at home, you take care only of the children, me, and the house. He constantly tried to make conflict between me and my family. He simply isolated me from everyone and everybody. Throughout the years, nobody knew anything. The house functioned perfectly. Everything seemed and looked normal. Then one day, I was at work and I got a call from somebody I knew from a job where I had previously worked. And he told me, your husband is planning for a divorce. I finally broke down and told my family everything. They supported me. When my husband did file for divorce, he tied up all our money in the bank. I learned that he transferred funds to other places. I went to the bank manager. I told him the story. He told me, my mother went through the exact same thing. I'm going to help you. In addition to all the issues around the bank, my husband also wanted sole custody of the children. He said he raised them. The court said no, and they also ruled that he abused me. For me, it was kind of a miracle. Today, I work 2 jobs, both as the CEO and in consulting. I enjoy my life and I enjoy my freedom. You know what? I even thank him for filing for divorce, pushing me to leave the prison. My therapist says I was in captivity and that you can get used to living like that. I woke up every morning for 15 years to a train wreck. It's unbelievable to think that a woman can be strong on the outside and run the world, but at home shower in cold water, admit that she's ugly, stupid, and sleep with tear gas. It's important for me to share my story because I do not have that profile that people think of as an abused woman. I met so many people who didn't believe me, police officers, attorneys, judges. No one took me seriously. There are so very many women who fear they will not be believed, who continue to maintain the facade. I am here to give them legitimacy and to tell them they are okay. I believe you.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you to Dr. Merav Shmueli for your words. And thank you, Amy Slater-Ovadia, VP of Operations and Resources at Women's Spirit, for bringing us this testimony of Reut, which is a pseudonym, one of the brave women who shared her story with us for the book She Counts, more than 20 stories of women survivors of abuse, which will be published in early 2023. Thank you. Dr. Catherine Royal is the research officer at SEA, Surviving Economic Abuse, the only UK charity dedicated to raising awareness of and transforming responses to economic abuse. Dr. Royal will share some of the world-leading initiatives being undertaken by financial institutions and new legislation that tries to address economic abuse as part of coercive control. Dr. Royal completed her ESRC-funded PhD on sexual violence and the media at the Center of Research into Violence and Abuse at Durham University. She also has extensive experience supporting victims, survivors of abuse. Dr. Royal.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here today. And a huge thank you to Women's Spirit for organising this conference and for bringing us all together so we can all learn from each other and hear what's going on around the world. It's so important to be able to do this. And I'm so pleased and so excited to be here today and to be able to share the findings of Surviving Economic Abuse's latest piece of research, which is a global review of what we know about economic abuse in the context of intimate partner violence. So before I talk about the research, I'll just share a little bit of information about Surviving Economic Abuse. So as mentioned, we're the only UK charity in the UK working to dedicate raising awareness of economic abuse and transforming responses to it. So we work across a number of areas. The first of these is raising public awareness of economic abuse, including through the media. We also create and share resources for victim survivors and for professionals across a number of different areas. And these resources are freely available on our website. They have been developed in a UK context, but they might still be useful or of interest for anyone watching today from outside the UK. The second strand of our work is around professional responses and systems change. So, for example, we work with financial services and seek to kind of improve the systems that victim survivors have to go through to ensure that they're better supported. We also work to create policy change, so in making sure that economic abuse is reflected within the legislation that impacts victim survivors and through influencing government policies and practices. And finally, all our work is based on the experiences of victim survivors and is rooted in evidence. So we conduct research and conduct evaluations of our work. And really importantly, we work alongside a group of victim survivors who are called the experts by experience. And these are women who've experienced economic abuse. And they inform and influence all the work that we do. And we're really grateful to their support. So I'm here today, very excitingly, to share the findings of our latest piece of research, which we published a couple of weeks ago, and we've been working on it for 2 years. It's a global literature review of what we know about economic abuse in the context of intimate partner violence. So the full report and a shorter briefing with some of the key findings are available on our website. And there's also another document which includes some more data information around the prevalence of economic abuse globally. So today I'll just try and give an overview of some of the key findings. I won't be able to cover everything, but please do take a look at the briefing or the full report if you're interested, and I've included the link for those on the slide. And the research was funded by support from the Oak Foundation, which we are hugely grateful for. So why did we want to do this research? As I'm sure you're all aware, economic abuse has previously been understood as a form of emotional or psychological abuse, but we know now that it's a distinct form of abuse, which takes place in the context of coercive control. which has unique consequences and so requires unique ways of measuring and responding and understanding to economic abuse so that we can fully recognise victim survivors' experiences. There's been a recent increase in interest in economic abuse in terms of research and responses, but compared to other forms of domestic abuse or violence against women, we still know relatively little about it. So, for example, a previous literature review conducted by Judy Postmus and colleagues found only 46 academic articles which had a partial or a full focus on economic abuse, which is considerably less than would be found for other forms of abuse. So given this recent surge in interest, we felt that the time was right to kind of bring together a huge range of evidence to capture what we know, so we can use this to inform future research, inform future responses to economic abuse. And similarly, we wanted to establish what we don't know about economic abuse and where the gaps are in knowledge and in responses. So to do this, we looked at 4 key areas. We had 4 main research questions, and these were what we know about how prevalent economic abuse is globally, including how many victim survivors experience it, rates within the general population, and how it might impact different groups and different communities. We wanted to find out what's known about the nature of economic abuse globally, so including the behaviours that perpetrators might use, how it might overlap and be used alongside other forms of abuse, impact it has on victim survivors, attitudes to it, as well as, being interested in post-separation abuse and the impact of COVID and the pandemic. We also looked at policy responses, including at an international level, for example, from the UN, across the EU, as well as at national level and regional levels, such as states or territories. And finally, we wanted to know how various industries and sectors were responding to economic abuse, including financial sector, women's sector, the domestic abuse services. And we also looked at responses from government bodies, financial counselling, money advisors, and others. And so we conducted a comprehensive desk-based literature review across a wide range of sources. And as far as we're aware, this is the first review which is this broad and looks at kind of academic sources, non-academic sources, such as those published by charities or organisations kind of working in the field, including both qualitative and quantitative research. To find the evidence, we used a range of search terms in a range of databases, quite a few. There's more information in the full report if you're interested. And we also kind of got in touch with lots of people that we were kind of aware of working in this field and asked them to share evidence as well. So we analysed over 850 documents in the end. And we analysed these using the research questions that I mentioned before as a starting point. And we also used the behaviours of economic abuse using 2 typologies. So this was Adrian Adams and colleagues, categories of economic restriction and economic exploitation. And we also analysed behaviours of economic abuse using Judy Postmus and colleagues, behaviours of economic control, economic exploitation, and employment sabotage. And of course, as with any research, there are of course limitations. One of these would be that the study's been undertaken in English. So we did translate a small number of documents from other languages into English. But obviously we could only include these if we came across them or if they were shared by someone that we'd asked if they could share any sort of sources they were aware of. In addition, we very deliberately focused on economic abuse in intimate partner violence. And so given this, the majority of evidence that we found was related to women as victim survivors and men as perpetrators. And we also found that some countries were represented in the evidence base more than others, though this did vary quite significantly by the research questions. But for example, when we were looking at industry responses, Australia, the UK and the US were quite dominant in this area. But despite these limitations, we've still got some findings which we think are really important, which I'm really excited to be able to talk a little bit more about today. So moving on to these, and I'll start with findings around the prevalence of economic abuse. So in the full report, we've summarised these by country and as well sort of by different kind of populations. And on our website, as I mentioned, there's another document which has the full range of evidence around evidence on prevalence. So one of the key findings here was that we found a huge variety in the questions being used to ask about experiences of economic abuse. which really impacted the reported prevalence rates. So for example, some research only used one question or asked participants if they'd experienced financial or economic abuse, but without explaining what this might involve or what this might look like. And that often meant that a lower prevalence rate was found. Really positively, some research developed or used scales designed specifically for measuring economic abuse, which asked about a variety of behaviours that perpetrators might use. However, almost all of these were developed in the US, though some had been tested and validated for use in other countries, and one was developed in Bangladesh. But importantly, where scales and measures were used, higher prevalence rates were found in the general population and in victim survivors, including as high as 100% in one study in the US. So further work is needed, which uses scales and which kind of recognises the full range of behaviours that perpetrators might use when we're asking people if they've experienced economic abuse. But scales also need to kind of be either adopted or created for different contexts. And we need much more work on the prevalence of economic abuse across a range of communities, particularly those who are minoritised. And so moving on to the nature of economic abuse and our findings around this question. So we know that economic abuse rarely happens in isolation, and that abusers will use it in the context of coercive control. And in her 2008 research, Nicola Sharp, who is SEA's chief executive, created the economic abuse wheel, which highlights how abusers might use economic abuse in conjunction with other forms of abuse. So we found a significant amount of evidence supporting this. And again, that's all outlined in the full report. And there was also a lot of evidence about how abusers can use economic abuse following the end of a relationship, and this includes the post-separation economic power and control wheel, which was developed by Jen Glinsky. And unsurprisingly, we found a huge amount of information about the impact of economic abuse on victim survivors and their children. And I've listed some of these on the slide. There was also evidence that abusers will use and will exploit existing inequalities, meaning it's really important that we have an intersectional understanding of economic abuse. And there was some evidence as well that perpetrators might use, for example, economic abuse in the context of migration and how migrant women might be impacted, as well as alongside kind of other identities as well. So overall, we really need much more research which develops this understanding of intersectional understanding of economic abuse, so that we can, make sure that all victim survivors can be supported. And as I mentioned before, we analysed the behaviours of economic abuse that we came across using two existing understandings of economic abuse, and so economic restriction and exploitation, developed by Adrian Adams and colleagues, and economic control, economic exploitation, and employment sabotage, developed by Judy Postmus and colleagues. However, during the research, it kind of became clear that these didn't always best fit the experiences of victim survivors that we were coming across. And so we recommend that the categories that were first developed and proposed by Nicola Sharp-Jeffs are used instead to kind of recognise the range of behaviours that victim survivors might experience. So these categories include economic restriction, economic exploitation, and economic sabotage. So you can see that it broadens the concept of employment sabotage, recognising that perpetrators might be able to sabotage victim survivors through other means, for example, through not paying child support or child maintenance payments, but that they also might carry out other behaviours around employment, for example, exploiting victim survivors by forcing them to work multiple jobs, forcing them to work unpaid labour, particularly in family businesses as well. So yeah, there's obviously more information about that in the full report, but we felt that these categories best suited the experiences of victim survivors. And moving on to policy responses and some of our key findings around that. One study found that economic abuse was the form of abuse that was least responded to by legislation globally, with only 113 countries having laws in place around economic abuse. A slightly older study, a couple of years older, found that half of countries don't have specific legislation around economic abuse, meaning that almost 1.4 billion women globally aren't protected. But positively, it's found that this number is decreasing as more and more countries are introducing laws to protect women. And some definitions of economic abuse in policy were quite vague. So, for example, saying economic or financial abuse without any sort of further definition or examples of what this might look like. Some legislation didn't provide direct responses or direct provisions for victim survivors, for example, through criminalising economic abuse, whether directly or through other means such as laws around coercive control. And because of this, there's a huge variation globally in what protections victim survivors have and what options they have for access and justice. And there's also been calls globally for more recognition and protection around dowry-related abuse, as well as to ensure that all victim survivors are protected. So the evidence suggested that the bodies which enact and enforce different policies as well, such as the courts or police, need much more understanding of economic abuse to be able to put these policies and protections into place to ensure that victim survivors can access protection. So whilst there's been a huge amount of progress, there is still a huge amount of work to be done as well. And when it came to looking at industry responses, we found evidence from a huge range of sectors. The responses and systems in place obviously vary hugely globally, and regionally and even in countries. So, for example, we found a lot of evidence relating to how financial services were responding to economic abuse, but globally we know that women have lower rates of bank account ownership, and these gaps have been found to be largest in sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East and North Africa. Similarly, government systems, areas such as social security payments, welfare benefits, child support and court systems can vary hugely as well, which can have a huge impact on victim survivors, meaning that many responses aren't available globally for all victim survivors. So I'll talk a little bit about some of our more findings from the financial sector and government bodies, but like I said, that there's much more information for all these sectors in the full report. And so because perpetrators can use a huge range of financial services to carry out economic abuse, it's absolutely vital that this sector is aware of economic abuse and can respond effectively to it and support victim survivors. The evidence that we found in the review highlighted that victim survivors had mixed and inconsistent experiences and responses from financial services. So, for example, research from Canada found that 33% of victim survivors said that financial institutions were unhelpful or very unhelpful for them. And of those who went to the bank for help, 64% reported that they received unhelpful support or no support at all. So positively, there has been some promising practice in financial services. So a small number of countries have codes of practice, which banks can sign up to. Some banks have also set up specialist economic abuse teams or establish specific funding for victim survivors. And there's also evidence of collaborating with specialist economic or domestic abuse services, for example, including training staff to better be able to understand economic abuse. And we know that many government agencies also come into contact with victim survivors as well. So again, it's absolutely vital that these agencies can recognise economic abuse and can prevent perpetrators from using these systems to carry out abuse. So social security payments can be a huge and really significant safety net for victim survivors who are leaving a perpetrator, but abusers can also use these as a method of abuse. So for example, there was evidence from Australia that perpetrators creating social security debts in victim survivors' name, and whilst these technically could be waived, evidence suggested that in practice this was really difficult to do. In the UK, the welfare benefit, known as universal credit, has been really heavily criticised as payments for both members of a couple are made into one bank account, meaning that a perpetrator can be given the full amount and leaving a victim survivor with no access to the money. So whilst payments can be split, this has to be requested, and the victim survivor will end up significantly at risk if she a split payment. Similarly, many migrant women in the UK also have really restricted access to welfare benefits, which limits their ability to be able to access refuge spaces. And when it came to child support payments, these systems were described repeatedly as facilitating post-separation economic abuse, with one victim survivor in Australia quoted as saying, "It's just exchanging one abuser for a whole system." There was evidence that agencies did very little to support victim survivors and to respond to abusers who were failing to pay child support either in full or reliably. And evidence from South Africa and the UK highlighted that perpetrators used COVID restrictions as an excuse not to pay. And this was essentially facilitated by a lack of action from the responsible agencies. Meanwhile, evidence from the courts and police often highlighted a failure to recognise, to understand and to respond to economic abuse, even when the laws in place did allow this, often due to a focus on physical violence and failing to understand the economic abuse and the coercive control. And this left victim survivors unable to access justice and again at risk. And so to conclude, I know that's probably very small on your screens and you might not be able to see it, but there is a version available on our website and it's in the report and the briefing. But the research essentially confirmed that economic abuse is a global problem. Abusers can restrict, they can sabotage, and they can exploit victim survivors' economic resources. It requires a coordinated response from a range of stakeholders all around the world to support victim survivors and limit abusers' ability to carry out economic abuse. We found evidence of huge developments in our understanding of economic abuse and responses to it, but we also found really big gaps in knowledge and responses. As I said, economic abuse is a global problem and we need global responses to ensure that all victim survivors can live a life free of abuse. And so as part of the report, we developed an emerging strategic framework for responding to economic abuse, which is what's on the slide there. And this captures the categories of economic abuse behaviours that I've spoken about. And as well as that, we've got some broad recommendations for stakeholders, which recognise that everyone will be in really different stages of responses. And we also highlighted some really promising practice that we've found in the research, which we hope will be useful to a range of different stakeholders. So thank you so much again for having me today. I know it'll be a brilliant, brilliant conference. Unfortunately, I can't stay for the rest of it. I'm really, really sorry to be missing it, but thank you very, very much for having me. And I hope you all have a really wonderful and enlightening day. Thank you.
איפה היית כל היום?
הסתובבתי קצת עם קרן.
הסתובבת עם קרן, לא? ומה זה השקית? גם של קרן?
לא, קניתי לי משהו קטן.
קנית מאיזה כסף בדיוק?
נשאר לי
נשאר לך? אז מה חשבת? שזה שלך? כל שקל שיוצא, אל תשכחי מאיפה הוא בא. רק אני קונה בבית הזה, ברור? עכשיו תראי לי מה קנית. איזה יופי. איפה המספריים? עכשיו אני אראה לך מה זה לקנות בלי אישור שלי.
אסף, אני לא גוזרת אותה כבר, שילמתי עליה.
שילמת עליה? איזה כסף שילמת עליה? שלי. רק אני אגיד לך מה לעשות איתו, ברור? חוץ מזה, כמה פעמים אמרתי לך לא לצאת מהבית בלי האישור שלי? כמה?! תביא את המספריים.
תעזרו לי.
Thank you to Dr. Catherine Royal. You and the rest of the audience can watch the recording of this conference if you would like to see what's happening next. And I would like to remind our Hebrew-speaking viewers that you could use the interpretation during the event. To enable interpretation, please click the globe icon on Zoom and select Hebrew. If you are watching from your mobile, please click the 3 dots and more menu and then look for interpretation. לקהל דובר העברית שלנו יש תרגום לעברית שזמין במהלך האירוע. להפעלת התרגום בעברית, אנא לחצו על אייקון הגלובוס בזום, interpretation, ובחרו עברית. אם הצטרפתם מהנייד שלכם, לחצו על 3 הנקודות בזום של עוד, וחפשו שם את התרגום. Economic abuse is the invisible weapon in an abusive relationship, and it is one of the main reasons cited to the difficulty of leaving and or returning to the cycle of abuse. Rebecca Glenn, the founder and CEO of the Center for Women's Economic Safety, CWES, Australia, founded in 2020 to raise awareness of economic abuse as a form of domestic violence. An advocate for structural and system change to support women's economic safety. Rebecca's presentation will share key findings from Surviving Economic Abuse's study about the prevalence and nature of economic abuse, as well as responses in policy and across different industries. In 2021, she was named an AMP Foundation Tomorrow Maker. Rebecca.
Thank you, Ronit. Thank you so much for having me. I'm coming to you from the traditional Yugambeh language region of Australia, otherwise known as the Gold Coast. It is an honour to be sharing the virtual stage with you today. It was great hearing Catherine's presentation, and thank you so much to Women's Spirit for the invitation. So I'll put a focus today on how the banking sector and the federal government and the government in Australia is responding to economic abuse. There has been a lot of movement in the last few years, which is really exciting, but like I guess so many people working in this space, there is still a long way to go. I'll start by giving you, I guess, a bit of context for those who are not familiar with Australia, because while we have a very big country in landmass, we are a population of just under 26 million. We have a federated system of government with 6 states and 2 self-governing territories, and then a national government, the Australian government. So most criminal and civil law as it relates to domestic violence is state and territory based. And many of our services, our domestic and family violence services, are funded at that state and territory level. The national strategy to end violence against women and children, however, is a national strategy. And a number of other things fall under that national umbrella. So family law, welfare, our welfare system, and also our child support systems fall under the national government's remit. Now, the other area I'll talk about today is banking. We have 4 major banks in this country. So while there are 97 banks in all, the 4 major banks, known as the Big Four, are really dominant. So they have about 80% market share. In terms of prevalence, we heard from Catherine there about how prevalence is measured differently in different countries. The most robust prevalence study that has been undertaken in Australia is measured on the basis of 5 questions. So it's certainly not the scale of economic abuse, nor is it simply a 1 question about have you experienced. So I guess it sits somewhere in the middle in terms of quality. But we do know that of those 5 questions that are asked, none of them relate to coerced debt. So the prevalent data in Australia shows 1 in 6 Australian women will experience economic abuse in their lifetime, but we know that's an underestimate given that the absence of that coerced debt measure. More recently, there's been some further sort of data crunching that has happened to show an estimated 380,000 women in Australia are experiencing it in any given year. So it's a sizable minority of people who are living with this and who will endure ongoing financial harm as a result. And that was really, I guess, what led me to set up my organisation, the Centre for Women's Economic Safety. We have this really significant problem that very few people understood and very little was being done about. As I mentioned, that is beginning to change. That's really exciting. So the mission of the Centre for Women's Economic Safety is to support women at risk of experiencing or recovering from economic abuse in the context of domestic and family violence. And we have two main aims: connecting women with appropriate information, services and assistance to support their economic safety, and working to reduce the impact of economic abuse on women by sharing their lived experiences to improve social, service and system responses to it. And that's really important because whilst some policies have improved, while there's some legislation in place to address it, it's only as good as how those systems and policies are exercised. And what we know from women's lived experiences in Australia, that they're continuing to have face enormous hurdles when they try to navigate those systems. So it's absolutely essential that those voices remain at the centre of our work. And we at the centre are supported in all of our work by a lived experience advisory panel. And that is, particularly powerful around that social service and system change that we really want to see. Very briefly, some key activities of the centre. We run money clinics, which provide one-on-one counselling for women around financial safety planning and guidance, helping people understand their financial position as they think about whether they maybe want to leave an abusive partner or have left and trying to re-establish or trying to rebuild. We publish a financial safety website, which I'll share a bit more with you later, but it's really just helping people to find information that's actually informed, domestic violence informed. We provide training, we do a lot of awareness raising, and as you mentioned in the intro, we're big advocates for change. So there are a lot of similarities across the world in women's experiences of economic abuse, but I thought I'd share just a small selection of some pretty common experiences from Australian survivors who have shared their story with us. Let me get this for you. That's so small I can hardly read it, but hang on a tick, I'll get to my notes. Okay, he maxed out the credit cards and the bank pursued me to pay his debts. I almost lost my house and my mind. When I left, he stopped paying the mortgage. By the time we did our property settlement, all of the redraw was gone. He made me go on the single parenting payment so that if he felt like not working or if we had a fight or whatever, I'd have money. We'd often have a fight and he'd disappear for 2 days, go through his money and come back 2 days later and rely on my money. But I was being made to take the risk there, being with him and being on the single parenting pension. And he'd threaten me, well, I'm going to go and tell Centrelink. And so Centrelink is our welfare system, and you're not allowed to get the single parenting payment if you have a partner. And we heard Catherine mention this system whereby a lot of victims of domestic abuse in Australia end up with a debt to the government of social security because of the way perpetrators manipulate that system. So that's what that quote is going to. And then just the last one I'll share with you, that once the domestic violence order was in place, he just refused to pay any of the bills for our house. The car rego, that's Aussie slang for registration, the car rego was due, but the registration was in his name and he was refusing to register it. We bought the car together, but it was registered in his name and I was using it to get around with our baby. I tried to do the rego myself, but I needed his license number. So you can see just in that small selection of examples, the number of different organisations and areas of our economic life that can be implicated. Welfare at the federal government sort of level, the car registration, which is something that happens at state government level, banks, housing, and so on. And so what I've got on the screen here with you is really what we call the response continuum. So CWES, Centre for Women's Economic Safety, works with and tries to influence right across the response continuum. So from the one end where the blue triangle is smallest, which is organisations who spend much of their time actually focused on domestic and family violence, so statutory services, specialist women's domestic violence services, who are seeing fewer people but have a bigger focus on domestic violence, right through to the sort of the universal services such as government agencies, electricity companies, banks and other essential services where they have very little specific focus on domestic abuse but are seeing huge swathes of the population. And so we do this work across the response continuum because economic abuse is being perpetrated in ways that involve organisations all the way across. And it also means that, you know, victims of economic abuse are interacting with this broad range of organisations. Some further examples I've just included in the boxes there in terms of examples of economic abuse being perpetrated. So, for instance, at the statutory end of things, you know, when a domestic violence order or an intervention order is put in place, you know, often we'll see a joint account being cleared out by a perpetrator. The use of lawyers to create costs for victim survivors, especially through family law, being forced to leave home, being forced to seek other shelter for safety without having any money or possessions or paperwork. And then at that more universal services end, where we see things like employment sabotage, where we see things like a joint name on a mortgage, so the big debt is held jointly, but only the perpetrator's name is on the title of the property, or being forced to claim that single rate of social security, as we heard an example of. So let me look now at that government response. So last month, Australia launched its new national plan to end violence against women and children. And this is really a 10-year blueprint that outlines some of the key steps that we can take as a society in Australia to improve outcomes for women. Importantly, it recognised that all sectors of society have a role to play, not just government and not just justice and specialist services. So for us, the biggest breakthrough was really having economic abuse included for the first time. So previous national plans not just didn't include it, didn't even mention it. And the big shift is it's not only there, it is a key area of focus, alongside the interconnected issues of coercive control, technology-facilitated abuse, and intimate partner homicide. Because we know that without economic safety, there is no safety. And so there's just a much better reflection of that in this new national strategy. And the other really positive element, and I guess the reason that the plan is such a better reflection, is that there's a real focus on lived experience insights informing policies and solutions, and there was significant victim survivor input into the national strategy. In relation to economic and financial abuse specifically, the plan commits to address financial stress as a major priority for women leaving an abusive partner or family member. And of course, while financial stress with cost of living pressures around the world is sort of ever present, we know that a significant amount of that financial stress is caused by the actions of abusive partner or family member. The plan also commits to developing a nationally consistent definition of economic and financial abuse. There are slightly different definitions in use in different state and territory legislation. A plan to train more financial specialists about financial abuse and its effects. Adopting a holistic approach to addressing financial abuse, including working with banks, credit, utility and housing providers and welfare services, and building the evidence on the types of economic abuse being experienced by different women and children, including the intersections with forms of technology-facilitated abuse. I thought I'd just mention a couple of other initiatives from the federal government over the last year or so. So the federal government is currently trialling a financial assistance package to help people leaving an abusive partner. It's called the Escaping Violence Payment. While it's funded by the federal government, it is administered through a community services organisation which has a national footprint. And this is providing victims of violence a package up to $5,000, which is a significant amount of money, to get to more stable housing. So the package is available within 12 weeks of leaving an abusive partner or having a change in housing circumstances, and it can include up to $1,500 cash. So that payment is available to Australian citizens and permanent residents. There is another payment that is available for temporary visa holders, which is being delivered through the Red Cross, and that has a value up to $3,000. Now, our view is people on temporary visa holders probably have a higher need and so shouldn't be being paid a lesser value. But anyway, both of those things are positive. Both of those things, I think, can be evolved into better versions of what they currently are, but I won't bore you with the detail of that in this presentation. So now I think I'll move on to banks and how banks are responding to financial abuse. So I'll start with, Catherine mentioned the code of practice, and a number of countries having a new code of practice. So the Australian Banking Association, which does represent those big four banks and an additional 16 banks, last year released a new code of practice, which requires banks to take particular care with customers experiencing vulnerability. And to go alongside that code, the industry also worked to develop new industry guidelines for preventing and responding to family and domestic violence, including financial abuse. And I thought I'd just share the key elements of that guidance before explaining what is on the screen there, which is sort of just a deep dive into one element of that. But the key elements of the guidance are to provide specially trained staff for customers experiencing violence and abuse, to commit to protecting customer confidentiality and safety, addressing abuse in transactions, which is some detail on the screen, making it easier to communicate with bank staff for victim survivors, reporting to authorities the domestic violence when necessary, assisting customers to regain control of their own finances when they have lost control as a result of a partner's actions, recognising that domestic and family violence is a contributing factor to financial hardship, and understanding the impact on credit reporting. So it used to be that a lot of victim survivors only sort of got in touch with anyone because the debt collectors were knocking on the door, and banks have agreed now that as soon as they understand family violence is a factor, they will not refer debt to debt collection agencies because of that, extraordinary additional stress that is going to place on someone. So the taking action to address abuse in transactions has been a really interesting process, which I think we believe can provide a model for potential future design considerations of banking products. So what has happened is banks have taken action in this country to stop or deplatform abusers using their payment platforms to send abusive messages with small amount transfers. So, in your online banking, in your description, you can usually sort of just state what it's for. It might be an invoice number. It might be saying, repaying you for dinner. And what we started to see was perpetrators of violence using that description field to send threatening, intimidating, and abusive messages, often with very small amounts being transferred. So $1, even 1 cent. So for not very much money, significant intimidation and harassment can continue to occur through that. So the banks decided that is not on. Once this was discovered, they actually sort of got together at that industry level to look at how they can work together to stop that kind of abuse. And data since 2020 shows that 500,000 payments from more than 300,000 customers that were abusive or inappropriate have been intercepted in real time. Customers are asked to change their inappropriate language, and around 3,000 customers were actually sent a warning letter that they would have their online banking suspended, or that they would be exited from the bank if they didn't stop that behaviour. And really interestingly, more than 90% of customers who received that warning letter from their bank about sending abuse through payment descriptions stopped sending their abuse. So sent a really clear message to perpetrators. You have a choice. You continue to abuse or you lose access to your bank account. Now, that was a little bit of a case study that we included in a report that we launched ahead of Economic Abuse Awareness Day, designed to disrupt reimagining banking products to improve financial safety. So this is a paper that is available on our website under the publications tab. And we're really hopeful that this is a contribution to the implementation of the National Plan to End Violence Against Women and Children. We think it speaks to a number of those initiatives or plans to try and work more holistically, think about prevention, engage with banks and credit providers to look at how we can better prevent economic abuse and better support people experiencing it. So we were really motivated. We did some research last year which showed that victim survivors in Australia experiencing economic abuse would be more likely to contact a bank than they would be to contact a specialist domestic violence service. I think there was a similar study in the UK that showed a similar thing. And so I think there's something really interesting about the role that banks can play. And we think this is essentially because money gives you choices, and without it, you have few choices, and banks are kind of central to that. So this paper does two main things. Firstly, it encourages banks to take individual and collective action to prevent products from being weaponized, and put the focus on those who use violence and abuse and make it harder for them to inflict harm. We can see, and we have this, significant and growing body of evidence about all of the ways that bank products are weaponized to inflict harm. We have that from the voices of lived experience, from consumer advocates, and even within banks, from bank-specific customer complaints and risk incidents. So it's imperative that banks contemplate these real-life scenarios. It's happening every day, and we think they need to consider that in their product development and in their review of the product design. The discussion paper calls for the finance sector to develop and introduce a financial safety by design framework. And that would be a tool that would allow banks to assess whether their products include features that would assist in preventing their misuse, making it harder for people to misuse, sending a clear signal that abusive behaviour is unacceptable, and continuing the work that they have been doing already through the code, through those new industry guidelines to improve support for victim survivors. We think there's more that banks can do. We think that they can start by committing to new terms and conditions that say a bank account is no place for abuse, and that customers who misuse products and services will be warned or exited, and in some cases reported to law enforcement. We also think there's a range of other things that are more innovative that could be done, making it harder to apply for a credit card online, making it easier to operate a joint account confidentiality and with some protections for both parties or all parties. And we also encourage innovation. So what if there were changes to product design that made the operation of a joint mortgage much easier to split if the relationship broke down? So we know that financial abuse can start or worsen at separation, and disproportionately, the financial impact of that falls on women. So we think it's really time to start reimagining these products. Now, I think I've probably run out of time. I will just say about all of that, this has been the positive shifts, and positive signals do not always translate to on the ground better responses and outcomes for people experiencing economic abuse. And so the implementation of these things is absolutely key, and that's what we will continue to do. And in the meantime, of course, every day we are trying to support people experiencing economic abuse who are navigating, complex systems, trying to disentangle finances, trying to understand how various products and services are being used or misused. And really all parts of the community have a role to play. So I thought I'd leave you with this resource that we've developed. This is the financial safety website I mentioned, but it really is about providing people with financial information that has a domestic and family violence lens. So almost all of the information that is publicly available in Australia that would support financial well-being assumes people are free to make different and better choices about their life and their finances. And of course, if you're experiencing that form of power and control from someone, it's simply not the case. And what do you do then? And so this is a website that has a starting place of you may not be able to make these decisions. So here's what that means. Here's what you could consider if you're safe enough to do so, and some services and resources that may be able to assist you through that decision making and provide some other options. So that's the financial safety website. You can see our URL at the bottom there, so cwes.org.au and financialsafety.org.au. But thank you so much for having me, and I look forward to the panel discussion to come.
מה זה? אני הרשיתי לך לקנות את זה? את חושבת שהכסף הזה שלך? כמה פעמים צריך להגיד לך ששום כסף לא שלך? מהבית הזה את תצאי רק עם המזוודות!
I'm sorry, I was on mute. I was thanking you, Rebecca Glenn, for that talk and that bit of positive shift. And also, I really love the opening screen of CWS. It's a very smart move. Thank you for this tiny optimistic message too. Thank you very much. And as Rebecca Glenn has described, banks and financial organizations' activities, including debt-collecting organizations, have a crucial weight in helping survivors of economic abuse to improve their lives. In our next lecture, we will hear from Professor Dalit Yasur-Borchovitz on the current situation in Israel regarding economic abuse, describing the existing remedies, sadly, very few, as we've heard also from Rebecca Glenn now, and elaborate on the lack of a law that would help regulate the protection of the survivors' rights. Professor Dalit Yasur-Borchovitz, PhD, is a social worker by profession and a feminist by ideology. She teaches at the Department of Social Work and Criminology at Emek Israel College. For the last 25 years, Dalit has studied issues of gender, especially different aspects of intimate violence against women, and issues of social work ethics. She has published several articles and a book titled Intimate Violence, The Emotional World of Batterers in Hebrew. Her latest work, together with Professor Orly Benjamin and Dr. Ariane Renan Barzilai, are about different aspects of economic abuse. Professor Yasur-Borchovitz.
Thank you, everyone, for being here, for listening to this important conference. And especially I want to thank Women's Spirit for inviting me, but more so because they do such important work all year round for many years now, and change the atmosphere in the subject in Israel very slowly, unfortunately, but not because of their work, but because the governments, etc., change so often. So before I start, I want to say that the presentation is based on a large-scale study that was conducted, as was told by Onit, with Professor Orly Benjamin, Dr. Ariane Renan Barzilai, and myself. And we mainly interviewed different social workers in different social services in Israel regarding economic abuse. And so I would like to discuss the findings and also discuss the situation of services in Israel for economic abuse victims. Okay. So as we all heard, economic abuse is starting to begin to be recognized in the world, but in the legal and welfare system in Israel, it is still very much a mystery, and I will explain this saying later on, because if it wasn't identified, it has been included in the section called psychological abuse and has not received recognition and significant attention separately from other forms of intimate partner violence. And as Rebecca Glenn just said, it wasn't the most important one, or it wasn't, it didn't receive enough attention as it should have done. Please change. So the question that I would like to address is, where can a victim of economic abuse in Israel turn to? And I will have you bear in mind, if you change the, again, the slide, that they turn to 3 state welfare organizations in Israel: the National Insurance Institute, welfare services, including violence prevention centers, which has just changed their names to Centers for Family Wellbeing. And I don't know the reason for changing this name, but obviously it points to different directions. And during divorce processes, they have to turn to the family courts assistance units. And that's where the institutions that we interviewed social workers and sometimes the clerks also. Please change. And I want to review the responses to economic abuse that are practiced in Israel, but I also want you to bear in mind that there is no law to define what is considered economic abuse. And therefore, there are no formal regulations. And quite a lot of the women we interviewed were not really sure although they were professionals, were not really sure what were the borders of this concept, economic abuse. So, and also I think that we found that they, oops, what happened here? That there is no identifying questionnaire or instrument that is formally taught or used by social workers or by women who work in these institutions, and that makes it quite difficult to for the workers to know who you may call it can be applied to or get the remedy, and who is not viable for it. Can you change the please? Housing was recognized in the literature as a crucial form of assistance in cases of economic abuse. In Israel, public housing is very scarce, and there are very long waiting lists, sometimes for years. I would say that under certain circumstances, victims of spousal violence who leave a shelter are entitled to rental assistance through the National Insurance Institute. However, in view of rental prices in most cities, this assistance is a drop in the deep sea. Ulbrich and Bond recently reported the crucial weight of the activities of banks and financial organizations. And also the women that spoke here before me, both from England and from Australia, mentioned this as very important institutions to help survivors of economic abuse. However, Ulbrich and Bond pointed at a low level of commitment to violence-aware actions, as well as low willingness to solve problems in the absence of legal representations or other advocacy, because a lot of times the agency lacks the understanding and ability to recognize economic abuse, and also the understanding, a lot of social workers don't have the enough economic education to be helpful for these women. Can you please change the... In Israel, there has been progress in this field of bank assistance in the recovering victims of economic abuse. The supervisor of the banks, Chedva Bar, recruited the Association of Banks and Credit Companies together with Yadid and Women's Spirit, and the organizations that operate the shelters were recruited as well. And together they formulated and published through the Bank of Israel a banking availability charter. Very interesting and generous charter, I may say. And this is a voluntary banking charter that was formulated and promoted by the Banking Supervision Department and the Association of Banks, together with Ministry of Social Affairs and Social Services. The intention was of creating a response for women survivors of violence in general and economic abuse in particular. Please change. However, since the initiative focused on a procedure to help mainly or firstly women who leave the shelters, the awareness of the opportunities inherent in it is stronger among social workers who are in regular contact with shelters. In most of the interviews we conducted in our research, it emerged that familiarity with the project in the centers of the prevention of domestic violence is scattered. Some of the managers knew about it well and had experience working with a contact person from the bank, but others did not even hear about it or knew about it vaguely, but did not know who the contact person in the relevant bank is. That is due also because this is not taught in social work schools, as well as other subjects that are remedies to generally to violence against women, and especially regarding economic abuse. But I must say that a few days ago after the rehearsal, Tamar, I think Tamar Schwartz, I think I made a mistake here. Tamar has informed me that in the past year or two, there has been a change due to the intervention of Women's Spirit. The Bank of Israel and the Association of Banks have agreed to expand the application of the bank's charter. So today, women who are accompanied by centers for the prevention of domestic violence can also use it, regardless of whether they were in shelters or not. And this maybe is important to notice that most women who are victims of domestic violence, intimate violence, and economic abuse do not go to the shelters. There's not enough room in the shelters. The shelter is not a solution that is suitable for everyone. So that cannot be the defining criteria for accepting the bank's charter. Please, another. Further responses in Israel are social workers' formal recognition of a victim of economic abuse as victim of domestic violence, because the law speaks now and the regulations only of victims of domestic violence in general, not of economic abuse in particular. That enables the National Insurance Institute to see her as eligible for income support and to separate her bank account from her spouse's bank account in a way that will make it difficult for him to use her money as his own. Social workers in the social services in the local authorities treat victims of economic abuse by trying to make accessible to them a basket of services that is compatible with that received by mothers in poverty. It's a very tricky solution because quite a few of these women, although they are in fact poor because their husband took all the belongings in a bank account, etc., they are not considered poor because they live in rich areas or they have a profession. And we heard at the beginning the story about a professor in a university who's suffering from it, and she would have it difficult to explain and prove that she's a mother in poverty, although she, in actual fact, she is. In centers for the prevention of domestic violence, social workers try to conduct therapeutic empowerment with victims and to connect them with civil society organizations that make other types of services accessible, such as court representations, advocacy, and so on. It's important, but it's not enough because different areas have different services and NGOs and civil society organizations that work. And as someone who's teaching and working in the periphery, a lot of their services that are possible in certain areas in Israel are not really accessible in others, and sometimes are not accessible at all. So so it seems like there are quite a few answers, but the truth is that in our study, we found that the fact that there is still no specific legislation in Israel that is intended to the prevention of economic abuse makes it difficult for the various services providers to assist women who are victims of economic abuse only. And we also found that in Israel 2021, there is still a lack of understanding and awareness of economic abuse by the public and even by social service providers. This was very clear when there was a discussion in the parliament in the Knesset about passing the law of preventing economic abuse, and the reactions were absolutely outrageous by the public, by newspapers, etc. So to conclude, if we want to improve the current situation, there is an urgent need for, first of all, more knowledge by service providers of economic abuse, what it is, what's its manifestations, and what solutions already exist but need advocacy and need help from the workers between them and the women. Second, a proper legislation and regulations and supporting budgets. Otherwise, legislation with no regulation and supporting budgets are useless. And even more or not less important, many more suitable, cheap public housing. First help, most important help for a woman who want to live from a domestic violent relationship or economic violent relationship. So go on, the next one. The most significant solution to economic abuse is for society to be more egalitarian. And I say that as someone who is studying women at work and women's situation at the labor field, as well as economic abuse and intimate violence. And meanwhile, it is impossible to wait for this to happen. So we will have to find some more specific solutions. You can pass it on. Thank you for listening, and I apologize for all the technological problems that probably disturbed a little bit, but I'm sure my point was made. Thank you.
Made very clearly. Thank you, Professor Dalit Yisur-Borukhovich. Thank you. For our next session, the impact of laws to halt economic abuse panel, I'm pleased to have Rebecca Glenn and Dr. Merav Shmueli and Nicola Eccleton, Social Inclusion Manager at Good Shepherd New Zealand, to the panel. Nicola was introduced to economic abuse when she worked at a family violence agency piloting a microfinance program to support its clients. Nicola has co-authored Good Shepherd New Zealand's 2018 research, Economic Abuse in New Zealand. Nicola, who was unable to join us in person, has recorded her answers to our panel questions, and we will start with her answer to the first question, which is, what laws in your country address the phenomenon of economic abuse, if there are any?
In New Zealand, financial and economic abuse was added to the Family Violence Act in 2013 as a form of psychological abuse. It's defined as unreasonably denying or limiting access to financial resources, preventing or restricting employment opportunities, or access to education. We would love to see it pulled out from within psychological abuse to be its own form of violence alongside physical, sexual, and psychological. And the reason for this is that psychological abuse is very difficult for the police and our courts to navigate, whereas financial and economic abuse often leaves a trail of evidence. So it is easier to be seen in a relationship situation. And an economic and financial impact of violence requires an economic and financial response. We know that people are left with significant debts in their names. They're left with bad credit ratings and bad credit histories. And those are things that require a very specific response that is different to the sort of response that you would have for other forms of psychological abuse. In New Zealand, we work really closely with our partners. That's been a big part of our work because that way we can feed back into some of the systemic and legislative changes that need to be made in this space. We work really closely with creditors and banks and insurance agencies, and we ring them up and say, this is what we're seeing with our clients and this is a pattern. Let's talk about how we can do better. We would like economic and financial abuse to be its own form of violence so that it shines the spotlight on this issue and people are paying more attention to it and they're thinking about it and they're putting an economic and financial abuse lens over their policies and procedures.
Oh, yeah, you are hearing me. Okay, so what laws in your country, in Australia, address this phenomenon? Are there any?
There are. I guess the question is more about effectiveness. So I mentioned we have the sort of the 6 states and territories, 6 states and 2 territories. Until about 2 weeks ago, our largest state, the state of New South Wales, where Sydney is located, had no mention of economic abuse in law at all. So it's a real outlier. But what has shifted is New South Wales has now become the first state to introduce laws against coercive control. And we are pleased to see that, therefore, economic abuse now is mentioned for the first time in that state. Unfortunately, it did not include a definition. And included just a couple of examples, so it wasn't a sort of more exhaustive list. So it doesn't really serve a purpose of being educative for police or for the judiciary, but it is certainly an advance. In terms of other potential legislation, there are 3 other states now looking to introduce coercive control legislation, which will be interesting to see how that develops. There is not one single definition of economic abuse in all of those different laws. So I think there's a push on in Australia to have that nationally consistent definition that was mentioned in the national plan, and then also to look at what are the principles that might make coercive control legislation more effective. And if I'm not overstepping the mark, to one other comment on this is
sure, of course.
Our smallest state, Tasmania, has actually had economic abuse not just in legislation, but actually as a criminal offence. Now, in all of the other pieces of legislation, it's not a criminal offence; it's a sort of a civil thing. So it can be recognised as part of a reason to have a domestic violence intervention order. But in Tasmania, they made it a criminal offence, but drafted the laws in such a way that it is almost never prosecuted. So it had a 12-month statute of limitations, very unhelpful for experiences of economic abuse, often over many years. And the second problem with that legislation is that you have to prove to a criminal standard, beyond reasonable doubt, that the perpetrator intended to cause harm or fear in their perpetration of economic abuse. So it's an unreasonably high bar, I think, for that legislation. So there's been some advances, there's been some blocks, there's been some problems and some, potential.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Rebecca. We've had some trouble hearing you in the last sentence. I hope it will be better in your next answer. I would like to ask Dr. Merav Shmueli now, what is the current situation with the law in Israel? And does it make a difference?
So the current situation is that in Israel, there is no specific legislation against economic abuse, as Professor Yasur Borchovich has mentioned. The law on the prevention of domestic violence from 1991 addresses physical, sexual, and emotional abuse, but not economic abuse. A bill which proposes to amend the law so that it would also include a reference to economic abuse has been under debate for several years. Women's Spirit has made contributions to the draft of the bill from the earliest versions. Its latest version from 2020 defines economic abuse as follows. An ongoing behavior by a partner using threat, coercion, or control, which is expressed by one or more of the following: preventing or disturbing a person's ability to be economically independent, including going out to work or opening a bank account; preventing or disturbing a person's ability to use an asset that he or she are entitled to use; hiding such an asset or hiding information about the asset; and economically controlling a person in a way which denies their ability to lead a reasonable daily life. In our opinion, this definition needs to also include the issue of non-payment of child support money after divorce, which is definitely, we think, a form of economic abuse. And also, we believe that the definition should more explicitly include the issue of coerced debts. But despite these comments, we hold and we say it in every opportunity that the bill must become law. When passed, the law will give a legal name to economic abuse. It will allow a woman to sue the man who economically abused her. It will also assist a man who was economically abused. The law is gender neutral. And it will give the courts more legal tools for dealing with disputes around economic abuse. I want to mention that some opponents of the bill argue that cases of economic abuse can be resolved under the category of emotional abuse. But I agree with some of the former speakers, including my colleague from New Zealand, Nicola Eccleton, that economic abuse must have a legal category of its own. It is wide enough and harmful enough. And also it contains economic elements which do not exist in every case of emotional abuse. There are in Israel legal ways to assist a woman who makes claims about economic abuse, but the cases show that without specific legislation about economic abuse, the courts tend to disregard this phenomenon or just to see it as something which is marginal in domestic abuse cases. Thank you.
Thank you, Merav. I'm moving on to the second question, which you started to talk about already. What efforts are being made to promote legislative changes in this arena? And who are the partners or the opponents to this? We will start with Nicola Eccleton.
Here at Good Shepherd New Zealand, we do a number of things to try and promote legislative change. Firstly, we try and talk to politicians and decision makers and policymakers as often as we can, and we are really lucky in New Zealand that it is small and we have great opportunities to talk to those people and bring our viewpoint across. We also spend quite a lot of time working with media to support clients to tell their stories of lived experience, so that people grow their understanding of what the issue is and why a legislative change could benefit more people. And the other thing that we do is we try and work in a cross-sector way. There's no point in trying to promote a legislative change that's going to really impact another sector when you haven't talked to them about that and worked through it with them. So going to government and policymakers as a cross-sector collective and saying this is the community perspective, this is the finance perspective, we're finding that is much more powerful than just trying to chip away on our own. So leveraging those relationships is core business for us.
Thank you, Nicola. And Rebecca Glenn, who are your partners in these moves and changes?
I think we've been really lucky in that there's really not I can't think of anyone who's against the idea of economic abuse being recognised in legislation. But that's not enough, because to actually get change, like a consistent definition, you need lots of people for it. And what is happening in Australia right now is that the argument is coalescing around an argument about legislating and criminalising coercive control. And that is a contested space. So, we are a colonial nation that has treated its Indigenous population incredibly poorly for a very long time and continues to do so. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are massively over-policed. Victim survivors of domestic abuse in general, but especially Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women are very often misidentified in domestic and family violence incidents, and that has led to there being a fairly significant cohort of women's safety and domestic and family violence specialist services who are actually quite concerned about what and how coercive control, what the legislation looks like, and then how it's enforced. So I think there's general agreement that coercive control is bad. There should be more sanctions, but real concern about what that will mean about the way police behave on the ground for particularly for marginalised populations. So there is a public debate, I think, that has begun and will be ongoing as there's a current national conversation to agree a set of national principles about what coercive control is and how it should be legislated.
Thank you. Thank you, Rebecca. And I would like to address the same question to Merav. What is happening in Israel? Are there any opponents here? Who are the partners to these moves?
Yes, Rebecca, you in Australia are quite lucky. There are opponents here. As I noted earlier, there have been efforts of many years to promote a law against economic abuse in Israel, and Women's Spirit has been very actively involved in these efforts for the past 8 years at least. Our partners are many, other civil society organizations, academics, politicians, professionals in different fields, and public officers in various ministries. Also, several governmental committees on gender equality and on domestic abuse have recommended such a legislation. The opponents to the law include some pro-family organizations. This is how they call themselves. They represent a very conservative worldview. Some of them have chosen the law against economic abuse as the symbol of all the dangers of feminism. During the discussions in the Knesset, our parliament, about the bill against economic abuse in October 2020, several of these organizations expressed their opposition to the bill. Their main argument was the need to protect the family from such a law. In their view, a law against economic abuse would allow an illegitimate intervention of the state in the family, and especially that it would violate every couple's freedom of choice, the choice to decide how to handle their financial affairs. Needless to say, the proposed law is not meant to intervene in a situation where both partners make financial decisions together. It is meant to intervene in cases where only one party decides, while preventing the other party, who is often the woman, from access to financial information and from the ability to make informed financial decisions. I think we can agree that this is much more than a debate about economic abuse or economic behavior in the family. It is about the place of women in society. The conservative opponents to the law represent a wish to see women less independent and more limited. Their words echo those of other conservative movements, which we see today in different parts of the world. Those who wish to take back many of the achievements of the feminist movement. And feminists from every part of the world must work together in response to such voices. Our challenge in Israel today is that following the most recent Knesset elections at the beginning of this month, some of these opponents are now in positions of power. But nevertheless, we will not give up until there is a law against economic abuse in Israel.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Merav Shmueli, and I would like to thank Nikolai Eichelton and Rebecca Glenn for this panel.
אבל זה לא אלימות. אין לך סימנים כחולים על הגוף.
וואו, כמה שזה אלימות. הרבה פעמים נשים אומרות לי, החירות שנלקחה ממני. הוא פשוט מוריד דברים שהם חיוניים לה ולילדים שלה, והוא יכול לפנק את עצמו באיזשהו משהו שבא לו, מתלוננת. הבינו בכלל על מה את מתלוננת? על מה בעצם יש לך להתלונן? שאלה טובה. אנשים לא מבינים ששליטה במקורות הכסף, שליטה על בן אדם אחר באמצעות זה שאתה בעצם מנחס לעצמך את כל השליטה על מקורות הכסף והפיננסים, אתה בעצם רומס את הבן אדם שנמצא לצדך.
את מי את מאשימה?
אני מאשימה את החברה, אני מאשימה את מערכת המשפט. אני כל כך הרבה פעמים שומעת נשים שחוות השפלה גם בבית המשפט. מה הכי מפחיד אותך? מה את עושה כדי שזה לא יקרה לילדה שלך? הכי מפחיד באמת שהמעגל הזה לא ייפסק.
מהי רוח נשית בשבילך?
שאלה מצוינת.
במילה אחת, תקווה.
Tikva, hope, as Shulamit Fishman, the intake coordinator at Women's Spirit, said, is the perfect description for those brave women that are changing their lives. Ms. Rosie Miller-Minster, the Director of Professional Services at Women's Spirit, is a licensed clinical social worker and holds a master's degree from Adelphi University in New York and in psychology from Queens College in New York. Ms. Miller-Minster has extensive work with crisis intervention and long-term community development in her work as a social worker at Queens Hospital Mobile Crisis Unit, New York, and her work at the 1 in 9, an organization that provides supportive treatment for women with breast cancer and their families. Rosie will share with us Women's Spirit's unique model. It is based on the guiding principle of equality, and that change includes a long-term relationship of building self-empowerment processes and achieving financial independence. Rosie.
Thank you. Greetings all. I am so grateful and honored to be here today. I came back to Israel 10 years ago after 28 years living in Queens, New York. For about 15 years, I worked in the field of psychiatry in the heart of New York, treating a diverse population inflicted by mental illness and stigma. I joined Women's Spirit in 2018 as the professional director out of my love for working with women, for women, and my deep belief that a person is much more than the pain she endured. That is exactly our modality at Women's Spirit. We believe that a woman can rehabilitate herself emotionally, financially, and vocationally despite of the abuse she endured. Our work with her begins with her choice to pick up the phone and call us. We call her a participant as she is participating in her journey. She will speak with an intake coordinator who will first listen to her story and together decide if we are the right fit for her or direct her to other places where her needs can be met. Empathy, kindness, respect, and empowerment are tools we use alongside vocational and financial skills and supports. Due to COVID-19, we had an influx of women seeking services and had a wait list for over 80 participants. And so we developed jump board group meetings to start their intake. And I'm happy to say our waitlist has substantially decreased. Our supportive service include individual work, group work, mentoring, vocational education, budgeting skills, and more, all in an attempt to improve her economic independence. She can choose all of our services depending on her needs for up to 2.5 years. The professional department consists of diverse workers with professional backgrounds in social work, business organization, and business management with deep understanding of violence, women, complex PTSD, economic abuse, and how it all affects financial freedom. We have branches in the north, south, and center of Israel, and we have workers working with the Arab community as well. Our approach is holistic, and our goal is to create a warm, safe space for a woman to focus on her path in becoming financially independent. We utilize many volunteers consisting of amazing women with various employment backgrounds and diverse cultures we call mentors and professional coaches. Our volunteers completed a 3-month training course and participate in monthly supervision groups run by the professional staff. They mentor and coach our women by offering them resources, skills, and supports, but mainly they believe in her and her ability to make a change. And so I would like to tell the story of one courageous woman who chose to pick up the phone and call us. Sharon is a 42-year-old, recently divorced female who immigrated from the Ukraine. She is a mother to 2 children, ages 12 and 13, and has a bachelor's degree in engineering. When she first came to Women's Spirit, she presented with very little self-confidence, evident by her sitting on her chair, hunched over and speaking very softly. Sharon was dealing with several stressors at the time, including history of depression, physical illness, unemployment, and overall feeling trapped in an abusive marriage. As a teenager, she suffered from physical abuse, and she was raped in her teenage years. Sharon indeed suffered a long history of abuse. What brought her to Women's Spirit was the abuse she endured from her husband. Sharon married someone from an affluent background, resided in an upper-class neighborhood. However, behind closed doors, she suffered from economic abuse. Sharon was given a fixed budget that he controlled, and anything that exceeded that, she could not buy. The most heartbreaking story, and the thing that was difficult for her to share, according to her, wasn't even the rape, as horrific as it was. It was the fact that she had to steal diapers from the grocery store because he would not give her money, as we often see in this type of abuse. She internalized the guilt and shame and felt that she could not leave him and destroy her family. After understanding her story and gaining her trust, her program manager and sat together with her to set short-term goals and long-term goals. It was clear that the first step in her rehabilitation is to experience a healthy relationship. Her program manager matched her with a mentor that met her weekly. Her mentor, a 30-year-old Russian lady, was so kind yet powerful and insightful. And that is exactly what she brought to their relationship. Their relationship helped Sharon with self-esteem and confidence. 6 months into the mentoring, the program manager met a different Sharon. She sat upright, radiated confidence, and realized that she is deserving. She understood that economic abuse was destroying her family and not her. Together with her mentor, they worked on seeking her entitlements, developing money management, and budgeting skills. Sharon was now ready for her next step. She joined an employment and empowerment workshop consisting of 10 group meetings that we run at Women's Spirit. She further gained clarity on what she wanted. Due to physical illness, she decided she wanted to become an interior designer and open up her own business. She realized that she will need to work on her assertiveness skills and marketing abilities. She courageously shared her story about a former coworker wanting her to take the blame for a mistake he made, and she felt obliged to do it. And so another step in her journey has begun. She received a scholarship for her studies through Women's Spirit and began working with our coach on improving assertive skills and developing marketing abilities. Remember, I said her program manager met a different Sharon? As part of her self-esteem and growing confidence, she received another scholarship through us for a gym membership, a collaboration we are so grateful for. Sharon's story demonstrated how various services and holistic approach were used in her path to becoming financially independent. Needless to say, there were many ups and downs, turns and setbacks alongside the successes, and every woman's journey is personal and individual. I will conclude by saying that Sharon's ambition is so admirable. She obtained her driver's license to expand her job opportunities and began part-time work as an interior designer. I thank you all for listening and for this amazing opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosie, so much. And please stay with us because we have now time for 3 questions from the audience, and I would love for you to answer one of them. I would also like to say that the questions we are not replying to, we will do our utmost. Women's Spirit will do their utmost, of course, to reply to you either via email or to connect you with the person who will give you the answer. So I would like to ask Dr. Merav Shmueli first. From the audience, someone asked, could you give an example of cooperation in the context of promoting policies regarding survivors of abuse?
Yes, we work through many cooperations with different actors, and I can mention one, I think very important, which has to do with the phenomenon of coerced deaths. We've had a big project with the partners in a legal clinic at the Academic of Law and Business in Ramat Gan. It's a law school. And together we created an initiative regarding women with debts, women in insolvency situations. And we had a conference, and she also wrote a very big policy paper about the need to understand the specific needs of those women, the need to treat them with a much more flexible approach, to understand that they had no control over how the debt was created. And I'm very glad to say that the Ministry of Justice are very responsive, and as far as I know, they are building a new model which is specifically for women victims of abuse.
Thank you, Merav. The next question from the audience is for Rebecca Glenn. How were the surveys undertaken in Australia in order to identify economic violence?
So the main survey, the one that I talked about that shows the prevalence, is actually an Australian Bureau of Statistics piece. And so they undertake what's called the Personal Safety Survey, which they do every few years. And the 5 economic abuse questions are asked in relation to a current or past partner. They ask whether you've ever been denied access to household money, denied working or studying, denied basic necessities, whether your partner ever damaged, destroyed or stole your property, or denied you access to the car, internet or telephone. So they were all actually included under a subheading of emotional abuse. But so there's some important tactics there of economic abuse, but just none of that coerced debt. A very big sample size too.
Thank you, Rebecca. And the last question is for Rosie Müller-Minster. Does your program also work for multicultural, in multicultural aspects like diversity, women from different communities, etc.?
Absolutely. We actually have on staff 2 Arab-speaking workers. We have volunteers. We are spread out geographically on purpose to be in the periphery and to meet different cultures, all over Israel, also including the Orthodox community and various communities in Israel. And of course, even in our in-house, we're very diverse with intentions to reach out to other people.
Thank you very much, Rosie. And we're almost at the end of this conference. I'm pleased to ask Dr. Merav Shmueli to share her closing remarks.
Thank you, Ronit, and many thanks to all the speakers today for their insightful and thought-provoking contributions. I especially want to thank Lior Lev-Ari, our project manager of the conference and also of the book that will be coming out soon. Lior, we could not have done this without you. Thank you very much. So today we have received a lot of information about the challenges of fighting economic abuse, about cutting-edge and creative responses that have been offered around the world, and about responses that are still needed. We've learned that economic abuse is a complex phenomenon, which does not stand in isolation, but is interlinked with other social phenomena. In the conclusion of this conference, it is important to recognize the social reality which allows economic abuse to develop, a social reality in which, globally, women's economic situation is worse than that of men. For example, all around the world, men earn more than women. Men participate in the job market in higher rates than women do and hold more senior positions. More women than men are employed in part-time, in low-paying, and in insecure jobs, and earn less than minimum wage. Men own most of the property in the world. Women are still expected to take most of the responsibility for household and childcare work, and this makes it harder for them to fully participate in the job market. And as a result of all of this, upon retirement, when they are older, women are also poorer than men. In such a reality, it is especially challenging for women to live abusive relationships and to try to make a living on their own. And in such a reality, it is easier for the economic abusive partner to continue and deepen his control. We must also remember that social perceptions about women and money may assist the development of economic abuse. When girls are taught that they need not understand money, that talking about money is unfeminine, they may grow up to be reluctant to deal with financial issues. They may make it easier to control it. That may make it easier to control them and exploit them economically. Therefore, when dealing with economic abuse, we must not look only at what is happening in the life of a certain couple. We have to look at the social and economic conditions outside of the home and address those conditions. Because of this social reality, and because economic abuse is a complex and multi-layered phenomenon, the responses to it must be as broad, holistic, and diverse as possible. These responses must include, for example, an explicit legislation against economic abuse, trainings and tools for identifying economic abuse in various sectors of society, financial literacy and financial empowerment education programs for girls and women, and a wide net of support for women who wish to leave economically abusive relationships, including assistance with housing, employment, and debts. Especially important is public education and a change of social perceptions, not only about the right of women to understand and to deal with economic issues, but also about the right of every woman to make independent decisions about every aspect of her life. This is the role of all of us, of educators, of parents, of communities. We have learned today that much is yet to be done in order to raise awareness and understanding regarding economic abuse. But while we still have a long way to go, I think that this conference has shown that we have also come a long way. The Economic Abuse Global Coalition, each of the member organizations, and other important activists, academics, and professionals have contributed to a growing and a rich body of knowledge about the phenomenon. Thank you all very much. Toda rabba.
Thank you, Mirav. And we are almost finished with this conference. We thank you, and we thank all the audience from many different countries in the world for joining us today in this very important conference. Women's Spirits continue its activities to make a difference in the fight against economic abuse, abuse both locally and internationally. And you can join their fight. You could scan this QR code on the screen to support Women's Spirit work. And if you kindly scan this barcode, you can press the links that are in the conference chat. And also you will be getting the recording of this conference and the links and the presentations in the email that we sent. Thank you again to all the speakers and all the audience for being with us. Goodbye. Thank you.